We have just been listening to King Charles address both chambers of Congress here. And as the first rule of public speaking, know your audience, King Charles did his homework. He was eloquent, he was funny, he was thoughtful, and he was incredibly respectful, starting his comments by saying, the United States Congress, the citadel of democracy, created to represent the voices of all American people to advance sacred rights and freedoms. And then later getting a standing ovation when he said the bond of kinship between the U.S. and the U.K. is priceless and eternal, is irreplaceable and unbreakable. There were several moments of standing ovations here throughout his speech. The king trying to reaffirm those strong bonds between his country, the U.K., and of course, the United States as well. And as I bring in Ryan Nobles here, who listened to the speech as well there on Capitol Hill, I wonder, Ryan, if he was sending a subtle message, and maybe not so subtle message, to our president when he said America's words carry weight and meaning, and they have since the independence. The actions of this great nation matter even more.
I don't see how you could not interpret it as such, Tom. And I have to say, being in the room, and it may not have been picked up if you were watching at home on television, when he said those two lines, there was a hush, almost gasp, you would describe, from the Democratic side of the chamber in that moment. That clearly resonated with certain members of Congress in the room. And then when he drove that point home by referencing President Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, saying that the world may little know what we say, but we'll never forget what we do. That was as powerful a moment, I think, as anything that he gave over the course of that roughly 25-minute speech. And there were multiple opportunities for him to use his subtle nature to drive home a point. Right before that section that you had brought up, Tom, he talked all about how the United Kingdom and the United States need to reinforce their alliance, and that they will continue to defend our shared values with partners in Europe and the Commonwealth across the world, and that they ignore the clarion calls to become ever more inward-looking, which, of course, has been a degree of criticism for the Trump administration at different points. The other thing I think is a very interesting thing to point out, which you may not realize if you were watching at home, I had the prepared remarks in front of me, that the king did not at any point stray even a syllable away from the remarks that he had prepared to deliver here in this chamber. A very much a different approach than what we see from Donald Trump or even any other president. Bill Clinton was known to stray from his script from time to time to drive home a point. Even when he was interrupted by applause or laughter, Tom, he would go immediately right back to where he was in his prepared remarks. Just kind of an indication of the type of public speaker he is and the type of public figure he is, that he had a very specific plan in mind, a very specific message that he wanted to send, and he did not deviate from that goal even a little bit over the course of this speech, Tom.
He showed no sign of nervousness, and when he concluded the speech, Ryan, both Republicans and Democrats were reaching across the aisle, quite literally, to shake his hand, to shake the Queen's hand as well. The speech there in the chambers, and this is somewhat rare, I know you alluded to this a little bit, but that both parties received this speech so well, it is clear there was something for everyone in this speech. But, you know, at times, especially when speeches are given in the House chamber, many times in the Trump era, they are speeches for an audience of one. And with that, I do want to bring in NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. That audience of one, of course, being President Trump. This is very early. The speech just wrapped up, you know, a minute or 2 minutes ago, Monica. Do we know, or how do you think, you cover the president every day, he's going to receive this speech?
Well, Tom, the president himself said that he wished he could have traveled to Capitol Hill to be in attendance for these remarks. Ultimately, he could not do that for logistical and security reasons, and because he wouldn't be in attendance for a speech like this. But that is how much he wanted to be a part of it. He was looking forward to what the king was going to say. And certainly some of the things that the king talked about, the president might disagree with him on. When the president specifically has made these comments about NATO in the past, he has been a very big critic of that critical alliance. It was clear here from the king's speech that he wanted to boost NATO and talk about how important it is to be able to have a system of allies when it comes to important things like the war in Ukraine currently, which is another area of a little bit of disagreement about how much support is still going there in terms of how the U.S. views that and how the UK views that. And I thought something else, Tom, that really stood out to me was what the king said in reference to what happened on Saturday night at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is that any acts of violence that are intended to make people feel scared or back down from their daily lives, he says those will not be successful, that those kind of intended acts are never going to be successful. And that was one of the moments that received some of the greatest applause in the chamber.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.